Okay, so okay, ready to go. Okay, so hi everyone. Great to be here. First time, first time speaker at India Cloud Security Summit. Hope you're all enjoying things so far. Very brief intro to me. I'm Michael Durkin. I've been Microsoft MVP in Azure for I'm now 3 years as of Thursday. Just about to enter my third year in the program. I'm lead Azure Solutions Architect. I work for a small company called Accenture, and I'm a LinkedIn Learning instructor as well. I've authored a course on hybrid networking for the AZ 801 exam track on LinkedIn Learning, if you want to go check that out. What are we talking about today? We're talking obviously about security because we're here, but we're talking about Azure security, and specifically 50 ways to secure your Azure. And where this the idea for this session came about was a song, actually, and it was this song, which you may or may not know, but this song is 50 years old this year. And so there's a nice bit of symmetry here. We've got a 50-year-old song, pardon, a 50-year-old song from a man talking about 50 ways to leave his lover. And at one point I was listening to this song and I more or less thought to myself, there must be 50 ways to secure your Azure. So I've done a little bit of a rewrite of the lyrics of the song. Don't worry, I am not going to sing it. I'm going to spare you that hell just for today. Maybe at the end of the session, Samik, if we get a little bit of time, I'll get the guitar out and I'll sing, and then you'll watch your attendees drop off. So I won't do that. But there must be 50 ways to secure your Azure. And what we're going to try and talk about here is we're going to try and talk about building up Azure security from the ground up. Okay, we've heard a lot of really good sessions. I was on Karthik's sessions earlier on where he was talking about container security. The program today across the 3 tracks is really great. But if we come back to the base layer of Azure, and the base layer of building up that landing zone security and defense in depth, that's what we're trying to get into today. And at a very high level, it sounds quite simple. You get in there, you deploy your landing zone as per the best practices, but I don't think anyone really in depth will think about the amount of layers that go into that and how to build that up successfully. So this is sort of my kind of lessons from the field, stuff that I've seen over my career. And obviously, the first problem that we've got with Azure is this, that, us cloud consultants, once we tell customers, once you move to the cloud, all of your security issues are going to be resolved. Okay. Obviously that is not the case. There's a lot more to it than that. And, if we get into it, and if we get into that intro to cloud security, right? And, this is a strange kind of statement to make about, how more and more organizations are adopting that cloud first approach. Okay. It is happening. You're seeing it more so. The enterprise customers have gone out there, they're following on from the likes of, and we'll talk about them later on, the big retailers, the likes of the Amazons, the Temus, the people like that. And then you've got the likes of airlines like Qantas, you've got retail like M&S and Harrods, and all these names are all really familiar to us at the minute because of recent things that have happened, which I will get into later on. But, why move to the cloud? Because, you want to modernize your services. You want to be able to transform your operations to be cloud ready, to have that global reach available to you that on-premises wouldn't have given you in the past. Okay. Security and compliance remains your biggest risk. Okay. And that's the biggest barrier to cloud adoption. And that's what takes time. Okay. And you've got the difficulties then of proactively addressing the complexity of secure configurations, because as Azure has grown and as the amount of companies moving to Azure has grown, obviously, we see it in customers, we see it out there. For those of us who are MVPs here, we see the demand from customers, and we see the lengths that Microsoft are going to try and, get those configurations right. Okay, we can't just stand up a service anymore. We have to design it with that secure first mindset. So if we look at this from the sort of best practices perspective, like what are we trying to do here at a baseline? Okay, secure landing zone. I talked about it previously. let's design and deploy the base security controls to create that landing zone on whatever cloud provider platform you're using. That could be Azure, that could be AWS, that could be Oracle, that could be Alibaba, it could be Google, it could be DigitalOcean. Okay, any one of those, any cloud platform, and it even applies to your data center and on-premises platforms as well. Okay, you're using those integrated security controls because you want to design reusable solutions. Okay, you want to try as best you can to use that out of the box security. Now, obviously, security, it's the old caveat, it's expensive, but we want to have those reusable solutions because the cloud providers are giving us the secure templates to have those security integrations in place. Okay. Next thing then is we want to combine those platforms and services with your organization's operational processes and procedures. Okay, we want to make sure that the security tools that are available, are still relevant. We want to make sure that those security controls are still there and are still relevant to your new cloud security posture. In some cases, there's a flip in that, and that has to change. Okay, so if we look at the actions that we need to take out of this, then we need to spell out the roles that are authorized to operate in the environment and what they're allowed to do. That's a baseline. Okay, the cloud was easy in the early days because you could just spin up a VM and give anyone access to it. Okay, but now we're into this world of authorization. Okay, where you have to authorize the roles correctly. You're then into secure connectivity, hybrid. It's a big word at the minute. Okay, you're still seeing a lot of companies with the cloud first mentality, but you're still seeing most of those companies will still have some form of on-premises presence still there. Okay, so you need to have that secured security model, and then your configuration needs to be enforced by policies. And again, you can apply your cloud service provider platform controls, and a lot of them are there and already built in, and we'll get into those later on. Okay, so got a lot of information to get through, so let's just flick through it as best we can, and I'll keep an eye on the time as well. Before we step into the full Azure configuration stream that I'm trying to describe here, let's take a look at the common threats that are there. First one, misconfiguration. Okay, it's where a lot of cloud security breaches happen. The problem with misconfiguration is that cloud infrastructure is designed to be easily usable, easily deployable, and it enables easy data sharing. But because of its complexity, it's easy for that misconfiguration or security oversight to leave your data resources exposed. Okay, and that's where an attacker will come in. You've then got unauthorized access, where your on-premises infrastructure, it was there. It was sitting inside your firewall. Your firewall was your perimeter. That was your edge, and you had your DMZs and everything else and your security controls there. But the cloud is outside your network perimeter to a point. It's sitting out there. It's on someone else's computer. It's a phrase that we hear an awful lot. This is convenient for the accessibility, but it makes it easier for an attacker to gain access, obviously. Okay. That follows on then, we've got our unsecured interface or APIs, okay, and most of those are publicly available, okay, these are well documented, they're made available. If they're made publicly available and they're for ease of customer use, then that then means that an attacker is going to be looking for those, targeting those, and trying to exploit, any potential weaknesses that are available there, okay. Hijacking of accounts, this is getting into kind of, weak password security, reuse of passwords across multiple platforms. If we go into kind of visibility then, the visibility side of things is around kind of the traditional monitoring platforms that you're using, okay? They're not effective for cloud environments, okay? So we need to think outside the box there. That limits an organization's ability to monitor and have full end-to-end visibility and observability over all of their resources. We mentioned, how easy the cloud is and how easy the cloud makes it to share data. That also goes for external data sharing as well, okay? It's convenient, but it's a major cloud security issue, okay? Malicious insiders, we've all seen them. It's the disgruntled employee who's, got a beef with the company, maybe trying to, exfiltrate data if they're moving jobs, something like that. Attackers will see that, and you see it on LinkedIn. Today is my last day here, or something like that. Okay, or my journey is coming to an end in a couple of months, or whatever it is. Okay, an attacker will actually latch onto that and try and gain access in that method. You know, cyber attacks, because it's publicly accessible from the internet. Again, we talked about that, about the unsecured APIs. You know, cloud deployments are the common target of cybersecurity attacks. Denial of service attacks then, I know we're draining this slide to death, but, you know, denial of service attacks is important because, you know, that can have a major impact. You know, customers are using the cloud to store their business critical and important customer facing data. You know, DDoS attack is going to have a major impact on that company's operations. And of course, the final thing then in our common threats, employees, lack of awareness. It's a common thing, right? And again, we've seen that. We saw that as part of the M&S attack, where the headlines are starting to come out. One phone call was all it took. And we see this thing as well about, what's it called? Authenticator, you know, where you're constantly getting the authenticator messages. You're going to click on one. You're going to just, you know, because people do it, okay? Not us cloud security conscious people, I hope, okay? But, you know, if you're the normal person and you're not engaged in your training routines with your company, that's the sort of thing you're going to get, okay? So, you know, you're going to get that. Let's jump into Azure security now, okay? And let's do the full 10,000 foot overview to see where it all ties together, okay? So first of all, if we look at the architecture and how it's all there, we've got our identity access management, threat protection, compliance, information governance, all of those things. The one thing you need to be aware of, obviously, as a customer, you know, is that shared responsibility model. The big thing to look at there is the top one, data. I'm going to get into that in a lot of detail in this, okay, where, you know, you are responsible for the data and for your accounts and identities, no matter what platform, no matter what level you go to, whether you go for an IaaS platform, VMs, Kubernetes in Azure, or if you're going for a SaaS platform like Microsoft 365, you're responsible for the data, you're responsible for the identities. You have to make sure that they're locked up, okay? And that's kind of where I go with this, because the first stage for me in any cloud architecture and any cloud deployment is deciding what is your identity going to be. How are you going to manage this? How are you going to control the access, okay? And if we look at Entra, right, Entra has got, you know, multiple versions, which I'm going to show you in a second. You know, you've got your free versions, you know, you've got your security defaults version, you've got your premium versions then. You've got privileged identity management, which can be backed by role-based access control. Multi-factor authentication is a default that comes in everywhere. As a matter of interest, show of hands, like if we go back years, multi-factor authentication has really all been there. Anyone use those RSA tokens, the ones from years ago with the little 6-digit thing they used to carry around? It's similar to what we're looking at with FIDO keys at the minute, but probably a little bit more, you know, older. That'd be the kind of memory we would have of the old days of the original multi-factor authentication, okay? You get into stuff like identity governance and access packages then, and this is where this should have come in earlier. If we look at the comparison of the different Entra SKUs that are available to us, okay? As you can see, the free one that comes in, like, you know, this is normally what comes in, you know, as your standard, as your starting point. As you move on, you know, to global admins only, you know, you get SMS as a second factor. The Office 365 stuff then gives you additional things down here. But then it's when you move into the premium SKUs that you really get into fine-grained control around things like trusted IPs, MFA for your on-premises applications, and all the way over. Like, the big difference in P2 is you start getting your risk-based conditional access. That's hugely important as well, okay? I mentioned the identity governance and access packages. You can manage that based on different types. You can manage it based on resources, based on groups, or based on Entra roles, okay? Again, highly recommend that anyone look into that. A P2 license, they're expensive, but there is a hack that you can do, especially if you've got an environment where you're using, for example, Azure B2C, where you can have guest accounts. I think you only need, is it 2 or 3 Entra ID Premium P2 licenses, and it's going to cover like tens of thousands of users, okay, on the platform for that security, okay? Interesting hack that's there. I think it's still there because I've been using it with a client recently. So, yeah, certainly, you know, but getting your identity sorted first is definitely the first thing. If we go down into network security, then it's how you're going to lay your network out. that starts with, how you're going to define things. You've got your VNets broken into subnets. Each are going to have their own network security groups applied. You're probably going to have route tables if you've got an Azure firewall sitting at your edge, or behind your VPN gateways or VNet gateways. UDRs from each of your spokes, sending the traffic back into Azure Firewall for inspection. Obviously, if you're enabling things like IDPS, free tier, that gets you up to a premium tier of Azure Firewall. Again, no one said security was expensive, but you look at the difference between, paying for expensive security up front and dealing with the consequences of a cyber attack. The other thing then is about service and service endpoints and private links, okay, where you're privately securing and using managed identities and are back within the managed identities to allow access to the resources. Data security, okay, we talked about data, and data is the thing that attackers are after. They're after credit card details. They're after customer information. This is the sort of stuff that they're after. And number of ways that we can do that and protect that, wordy here, and the number of different data streams you have. So you've got at rest, where you can use storage encryption and SQL database encryption services. You've got in transit, where you can use, SSL TLS, and that's kind of, where your traffic flows will come from your on-premises into your Azure or cloud environments. SSL TLS if you're using VPN Gateway or Express Route. I've mentioned storage, REST API access. If you're accessing your storage, do it over that REST API. If we're looking at data in use, you're into things like confidential computing, okay, where you're getting into, high performance VMs with trusted platform modules. Then you're into key management, where you're using solutions like Azure Key Vault. I've put in HashiCorp Vault here. It's not an Azure native service, but I think it's probably the next one in the line, okay, because if so many people are using Terraform as a service for their IAC builds, which we'll get to in a second, then you may be using HashiCorp Vault as well. And then you're into classification. Classifying your data, putting labels on your data. You're going to use Azure Information Protection, and then you're going to use the rights management service to make sure that your data is protected. And everyone, and where would you use rights management? And everyone has seen it, that little box at the top of your Outlook where you classify your email that you're sending into confidential, business critical, etc. If we move into application security then, so we've covered identity, we've covered networks, we've covered data. Now we're going to start deploying and protecting our applications. Okay, so the epitome of zero trust in Azure comes when you deploy an Azure App Gateway with a web application firewall attached, because you're getting the OWASP 3.2 core set, and effectively anyone who's used it will tell you if you turn that on, nothing is going to work. That's the way you want it to be, because you want to be able to clearly define what the roles are and what rules you need to, be opening up on that OWASP rule set. A lot of the key ones there, the big one that everyone looks for is SQL injection attacks. Okay, if you're hosting SQL in your environment behind a WAF, absolutely, it's one to turn on. Still in preview at the minute, but it's one to call out here, is private deployment for Azure App Gateway. So previously with App Gateway, what you would have done was you needed public and a private IP. Private deployment takes that public IP element away. So if you're using, let's say, if you're putting this in behind a firewall and you want to NAT your public IP off a firewall, or if you're using, some sort of other DDoS layer on the outside, be it Azure DDoS protection, be it something like, AT&T or other companies will provide DDoS layers as well, where you're just natting the address in. Okay. API management. In the application security world, like where I would have seen this for customers, if you're managing APIs and if you're presenting APIs, they'll be presented off, to that web application firewall with the back end coming back into the APIs. You're getting into API policies there. Okay, so prime example of an API policy would be things like header length, specific details in the header that allows, the request to go through. You're talking about layering here. Okay, so you're layering at the WAF level to ensure that you've got, you're hitting the API in the back end and that the WAF rules are protecting that. But then at the API layer, you're doing the check of the actual request that's coming in. Moving on then into secure deployments with Azure DevOps and GitHub. And what I mean by secure deployments then is, you're setting up your code, be that Terraform, Bicep, Polimi, whatever, Ansible, whatever way you want to do it, but you're building in your code check steps then. And if you think of Terraform or any of the other ISCs, like you're looking at things like check off scans, inspect testing. You could be integrating SonarQube on top of that. You could be putting GitHub Advanced Security in on top of this as well. Okay. Another thing for application security, and it's one that's not really thought about that much, is drift detection. Drift detection comes into play, I suppose, when we're coming back into our identity governance there, where your service principal should only have access to deploy and administer, if we're dealing in a perfect world here, to deploy and administer and make changes to resources that you've deployed on Azure. Let's be honest, everyone knows that doesn't happen. Okay, the advantage of drift detection, where I've seen it working, is okay, someone's gone in, they've given themselves admin rights, they've made a change, drift detection is going to pick that up, okay, because it's going to run a plan. It's going to say, okay, this is a deviation, and you can redirect that and log that into your DevOps or whatever your service management tools like ServiceNow or something like that. Good way to keep your code base at a baseline as well. Obviously, I'm going to harp on about Terraform here for a second, because you've got your state file there, and what that's helping you to do is, in multi-environments where you've got, let's say, your dev, test, UAT going forward into prod, that's going to help you with environment consistency, making sure that your multi-stage pipelines, making sure that those deployments are consistent, making sure they're the same, so that you've got confidence from your UAT layer that you're deploying into production then at that point. Final thing then, AKS, big topic at the minute, and you've got container security there with AKS as well. Okay, and there's also Azure App Gateway has its own container security there as well, built in. So that's obviously another additional feature that's available. So we've built it up. We've got our identity, we've got our data, we've got our networks, we've got our apps or our VMs, and we've got our secure IAC in place. Okay, we're then into our monitoring and detection. And of course, Defender for Cloud is the one that kind of jumps out at everyone. Okay, you turn it on, you integrate it with your products. How many different options are available in Defender for Cloud? There's so many. I don't think anyone knows anymore. We mentioned, containers there earlier on, with Defender for Containers on the last slide. You've got Defender for Identity, you've got Defender for Storage, you've got Defender for SQL. Do you need to turn them all on? That's your decision, and it depends on what layers and how critical the data is there within those particular storage and data stores, what's being held in them. But look, Defender for Cloud, it's a very versatile product. It's a full versatile suite. It's great, and it's also, I'm going to talk about Sentinel in a minute. Sentinel has now been integrated fully into Defender for Cloud. It's not going to be part of Azure anymore as a standalone product. That's good news, because it means that the integrations are going to be fully there and available, and you've got a single pane of glass for management. One that's often not thought about as much, okay, when it comes into monitoring detection, Azure Advisor. I like it. Why do I like it? Because it's there, it's a single pane of glass. It's sitting there on top of all of your services, giving you recommendations, telling you health checks aren't turned on for your app services, or you haven't enabled, zone redundancy on your app service or on your function apps or on your storage. You haven't enabled backup. It's often overlooked, but it's sitting there. It's free when you deploy the service, and you can get alerts out of it, and it's important as well. Azure Monitor and Log Analytics, obviously, take your environments when you're deploying your environments, send everything to Log Analytics. Now, flip side to this, yes, it gets expensive. Sending all the data there gets expensive, but when you're trying to integrate your Log Analytics with your application insights, you've got data streaming in, and you're going to look at your application insights, and it's going to say, okay, you've got 1 million different traces, events, requests, exceptions for the last 24 hours. It looks overwhelming, but it's really, really useful in defining what you need to know, what the issues are in your environment, what the issues are in your code, what alerts you need to set up for your SOC teams, for your support teams, for your managed service teams, what they're going to need. Talked about Sentinel very briefly. Everyone knows what Sentinel is. It's collecting your data from the Azure services. It's using your advanced analytics, and you've got, your integrated machine learning there to detect your incidents and anomalies, setting up your automated response, and not just Azure, but your full suite. You can set that up to cover 365, any of your Power Platform, any of that sort of thing as well. Okay, so it's fully there, fully available to you. Slightly in the same vein, from a threat protection and response, I mentioned DDoS earlier on, which is kind of sitting out there at that layer. You can do that at tenant or IP level. It's protecting your applications from those DDoS attacks. It's monitoring traffic flows to detect the abnormalities and the patterns associated with DDoS, stuff like, volumetric, protocol-based app layer attacks. And again, it automatically mitigates those attacks by scaling up the resources, diverting traffic. But again, I mentioned about tenant or IP level. Yes, you can do it at tenant level, but for tenant level, it only applies to a single zone from memory. That's how the cost works. Then you're getting down into IP level. So depending on how many public IPs that you've got available to you there. I mentioned the Defender suite. I think Defender for Identity is one of the nicer products there. Okay, sits well with Entra ID Premium SKUs, gives you that extra layer, gives you that extra visibility on what's going on within all of the authorizations, authentications, and your general user traffic within the environment. And of course, the big one, Azure Policy. Everyone forgets about Azure Policy sometimes when you're setting your baselines. And you can set up Azure Policy for things like cost management, to a certain point where you're saying, okay, I only want to deploy certain VM SKUs and I only want to deploy them in a certain region for Azure. But people tend to forget that Azure Policy has also got the Azure security benchmarks built into it for things like ISO 27001, PCI DSS, NIST. They're all there, they're all available, and you can measure your environment against that. And that's nice from an audit perspective, because when your auditors come knocking and say, well, okay, are you ISO 27001 compliant? Yes, we are, because Azure Policy says so. You can also link all of your alerts out of that as well. At a very high level from security best practices, we're going to look obviously at principle of least privilege, and that can go Azure resource-based or user-based, as I said back on the identity governance slide there. Azure Policy, we've just talked about security audits and compliance checks. It's there, it's available to you in that single pane of glass, and you can output the reports from it. Data backup and recovery is the one we haven't talked about, and this is where we go back to those common security threats around, the attack surfaces. How quickly can you recover from this? We're talking about our dev, test, UAT, prod environments. Your prod environments go down, okay? Do you have things like, site recovery? Do you have zone redundancy? Do you have geo redundancy available to you? How quickly can you recover from that attack if it does happen? Okay, and again, we're getting back into misconfiguration. So for the likes of platform services, then you're into things like staging slots. Okay, we've all seen those on things like Azure Functions, on app services where your staging slots come in. From an IaaS perspective, you've got things like Azure Backup, and then you've got third-party tools. So Azure Backup, I have a love-hate relationship with Azure Backup, to be honest, because it's an IaaS-only tool, and then you're also relying on, and this is one thing to be careful of, the different Azure tools, and particularly different Azure PaaS tools. And I'm talking about things like, SQL managed instances, Cosmos, things like that. They've got their own layers of backup that are built into the product. I'll take Fabric as an example from the data perspective. Fabric doesn't do backup. Fabric does automated geo redundancy, which is fine in a sense, but for some companies it's not, because they want to keep their data in a certain geo. So that's where things kind of happen there. The beef I've got with Azure Backup really is around things like, okay, we can do this for IaaS level, we can do it for Azure SQL, we can do it for Postgres, we can do it for Kubernetes, for example, and you can set your kind of long-term strategies around that. But then you're having to use a different tool to, manage the rest of it, manage your SQL, manage your PaaS services. Personal opinion, of course. I may get kicked out of the MVP program for saying this. I hope not, but there you go. Hello, Microsoft MVP team. If we move in then, moving quickly along from that little rant, I'm going to quickly talk about security tools. We keep talking about, things like the Defender suite. We keep talking about Sentinel. Azure Information Protection, I briefly mentioned that before. You're into your data classification, okay? And it's about things like, classifying your data, making sure your data is only available to the right people at the right time. You're talking about things like Purview for compliance then on top of that as well. And then things like RMS, as I mentioned. You've then got various third-party integrations as well. So like if you're going for a multi-cloud setup, if you're stepping outside of Azure, you want to put some of your stuff over on AWS, let's say you're going to run on AWS's version of Kubernetes, for example, for your, you can bring in your third-party integrations there for things like Arc. That'll reach out to on-premises, it'll reach out to AWS, and then for your vendors, you've got, third-party ship vendors where you can ship your logs, and, we're talking about QRadar, Datadog, people like that. One that people don't really talk about then is secure access in environments. So we've set up our environment, but how do we access it? Okay, we're not going to access it directly from our company or our third party or our consultants' devices. We want a secure method of access. Number of different options here. Okay, obviously Azure Virtual Desktop, you've got multiple options there. You can deploy an app or you can deploy a desktop, which can either be personal or pooled. I've always thought Azure Virtual Desktop is more of a user-based and user access-based system in much the same way as Windows 365 Cloud PC is, okay, because you're talking about per user license agreements. When you're getting into secure access for admins, for developers, you're talking about things like Bastion. Single point of access, depending on your SKU, you can run it across peered VNets. The key thing is it's not configurable at a certain point, okay? If you're into DevBox then, okay, DevBox is your secure, ready to code, available solution there for your devs that is available, okay? Number of different options there, depending on what your company's profile is, but certainly for access into those management environments, you're probably looking at something like DevBox and integrating, your dev environments, your DevOps, all that sort of thing into that as well. I'm just going to throw this up and I'm going to talk through this for a minute. So the standard Azure landing zone Visios that are there in the Microsoft Learn site, they always give me a bit of a headache because you're trying to make out what they are and where they are. But if we take a look at this as an example of the stuff that I've just talked through there, okay, so we can see here you've got your internal or your external user, and it's important that we distinguish internal and external here, because when we're coming into an app gateway, I talked about that private deployment model, and that's important as well, because we talked earlier, your internal users are as much of a threat to you as your external threat actors are, okay? So they're coming in through your app gateway. From your corporate office, then you've got your express route and your site-to-site VPNs. But if we look at, let's say, app gateway, in order to access your app environments, you're hitting APIM straight away. And then you're hitting whatever it is behind that, if it's containers, if it's functions, if it's app services, if it's static web apps, if it's Cosmos or SQL or storage accounts that are storing your data, if you're storing things in key vaults, secrets, certificates, passwords, all that's in there. As I said, your corporate traffic's coming in over express route or site-to-site VPNs. You've got all your management up here in your log analytics. Your private DNS zones are hosted up here as well. And this is also where, and PBA, I'll explain PBA, private build agent. We know the concept in DevOps where you can go for Microsoft hosted agents or build your own pool virtual machine scale set effectively of private build agents. I like the PBA model better because it gives you a lot more control over what you can do. And it's also about kind of speed of deployment as well. Now, there's obviously the headache there of securing those, updating those. But because they're PBAs, you're on a recreate and destroy, so you should always be getting the latest version of the VM. You just manage that as you're going through your product lifecycle. You've got your Key Vault over here holding your secrets for that, and Azure DevOps here as well. And then up here, you've got all of your different services that I was talking about earlier. We can see what, we're talking about the lines coming back, but we've also got our UDRs here. We mentioned our user-defined routes. So basically from every subnet here, we're going to say, and from every VNet here, what we're going to say is we're going to send back all of the traffic to Azure Firewall. So that's going to be your central hub. So it's a defined hub and spoke model. The spokes shouldn't be able to talk to each other. Everything should be flowing back through the hub. All of the traffic should be interrogated, available. Okay. Before it passes through and before it passes back out to the internet as well, because obviously you've got a responsibility as an organization, and I suppose us as consultants as well, if we're talking about this, we've got a responsibility that the data we're sending out of each organization or out of whatever organization, if there's data going out to a third party, we need to make sure that's secure as well. Okay, so we've got that responsibility, and this is where things like your IDPS comes in. Your SSL termination, all that sort of thing. In conclusion, and I will take a breath because I'm nearly at time. Okay, what we're aiming for here is we're aiming for well managed, well architected, layered defense in depth, and regular audits and access reviews. I think we talked, and I opened it up about the good old days. And the good old days was, you had your firewall at the edge, and that protected all of your infrastructure. And the first step that companies really took on that journey was the Office 365 journey. Okay, where Exchange wasn't viable anymore. They moved all of their email data to the cloud. Okay, and it's been slow after that in moving all of the other services, because okay, email was a problem. We've got all of our services back here on premises running on our VMware stacks, and that's a totally other story around cost, etc. But yeah, look, that's there. That's a problem. And you're just looking here at some of the headlines that we've all seen recently. I mean, the Qantas attack, it's a single phone call, and it's humans that are the weakest link in the chain, right? So effectively, you're not just protecting your infrastructure, you're protecting the humans who are actually operating your systems and operating your infrastructure as well. You're wrapping something around them to make sure that they can't do data exfiltration, that, they can't do, responding to these sorts of things, phone calls. Oh, can you hit that number in your authenticator app for me, please? Or can you click on this link of the email I just sent you? Or can you press 2 on your phone because you're probably in an IP phone system? You look at what happened with Marks and Spencer's, the online orders, and this is the interesting one, not the headline, but the sub-headline below it, contactless payments in stores. How accustomed have we become as a society to taking out our credit card or our debit card? And it's just like tap, beep, that's it. You don't even think about it. No one's carrying cash anymore. That's what they're targeting. And that it took down that organization. One that's close to me here in Ireland, the HSE cyber attack, which crippled our health system back in 2021. You look at this, 500 legal actions after 102 million. What good's a legal action? It's gone. The data's gone. It's out there. The attackers got in. And then the final one here that I'm just going to look at, 4 arrested in the UK over the various cyber attacks. Yeah, that's great. 4 guys are going to get arrested. 4 guys are going to go to jail. That's good. But again, it doesn't have an effect on me and you. The data's gone. It's out there. The breach happened, whether by poorly managed or whether by user again answering a phone or clicking a link in an email. It's gone. It's out there. It's great that they caught the guys and arrested them, but to you and me, the Joe Soap, are we going to have confidence in these brands? Are we going to have confidence in the likes of a Qantas or a Marks and Spencer's to hold our personal and financial data anymore? No, I don't think so. I want to hugely thank Vignesh and Samik, and all of the organizers for having me. I am always open to questions, and I am always open to contact. These are my contact details. I have not regularly blogged in a while, but starting to get back into it now. Email me directly. I'm always open to email. I'm always open to questions. I'm always up for a chat. I'm always up for a call if anyone wants to have a chat about anything. And you'll find me on the various socials. Unfortunately, I'm still on X, but branching out into Blue Sky now as well. And that is all from me. And I am quite happy, if we've got time, if anyone wants to ask any questions or anything like that. And I hope you found the session insightful and useful. And thanks again for having me,
Michael. And thank you for the audience. Please feel free to ask any questions you have. Either you can write it in the chat or you can unmute yourself to ask the question. Right.
And if you're shy, please do feel free to reach out to me.